All right, everyone, hello, welcome back. Today is Wednesday, June the 4th. You're watching Dan's Astrology. I'm your host, Dan. Yesterday I recorded a video about Jupiter entering Cancer, squaring Saturn and Neptune, and this could be considered a follow-up, or there's certain dynamics going on that I'd like to address. Basically, to do with the difficulty around the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is a fairly... it's difficult because Saturn is the greater malefic, and as we've seen in recent years, when Saturn conjoins one of the outer planets, like when we had Saturn-Pluto, that's when around COVID happened, right? So there's this quality about it's not as easy to deal with. It's not as easy subject matter. But I have been making astrology videos for the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, and I have this sense to keep going with it. However, I notice a pattern developing, right? And I have to admit, in the recent trajectory of this channel that I'm making, there was a bit of I had a, I almost wasn't going to do a video for the Canadian federal election, but that video that I recorded has nearly 500 views, so that's a lot better than what my other videos are doing. But since then, since I had more success than usual with my video about the Canadian election, I have kind of fallen off in terms of my performance. Although what I've noticed with YouTube doing this channel is that it tends to be a bit spiky and uneven, and there tends to be certain things which perform better than others, and that I never seem to be able to totally predict what's going to perform well and what's not going to perform well. And there is some basic, first of all, a couple years ago, I went through something where a friend of mine who lives in Australia was visiting from out of town, and I don't know if it was like the psychological factor of like dealing with my friend who was visiting and feeling self-conscious about my project in light of this social dynamic or something. But he was actually very supportive. But nonetheless, there was something going on a couple years ago where I had an increased sense of insecurity around my making stuff that wasn't performing very well. I mean, I guess, I don't know, maybe there are a lot of people who do a lot of different creative work who can relate to this, where it's if you put a lot of time and energy into a certain idea and then not see a return on that, it's kind of discouraging, right? And however, the thing is, it's like I also have, a number of other creative pursuits that are even more difficult when it comes to this. So it's kind of like, at some level, I think I have to develop like a thick skin and just kind of like be tough enough to keep creating when not and have the sort of self-discipline not to look at the numbers, right? But I have to admit that recently I recorded a video which didn't do very well in terms of the numbers at all. And then I was like, in my attitude of dogged persistence, I decided to stay with it and record another one, which also didn't do very well. And there's a sense of it being kind of discouraging. But however, there is something about the current... There's another kind of dynamic at play where, admittedly, Saturn and Neptune is a difficult transit, and it's a kind of a gloomy one, right? It's by nature a gloomy transit. It's not very positive, right? And there is this sort of question about when it comes to the topic of like fate in astrology and fatalism, oftentimes when you combine the idea of fated things happening with the idea of the less positive planets, it emphasizes this doom and gloom, not just doom, but a kind of the fatal doom, the doom that is fated and fatal, in that it's final, there's nothing you can do about it, kind of thing, right? And there's a issue around all this. Now there's the idea of being like dealing up front with the negativity of this signification and dealing with negativity as it shows up on a number of different levels, whether that is a personal level or whether that's a collective level, a societal level, or the level of worldwide politics and stuff like that, right? And I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that when I'm not focusing so much on my own content, but if I just start, like, I made a conscious decision to stop using social media and to, like, sometimes I've been using, to be honest, I do use it for some practical things like Marketplace, right? Facebook Marketplace or something. But I'm trying to use it in a way that I'm not using it in a social way, but in a practical way, as if I want to sell things, if I want to downsize my personal belongings or something like that. There's a practical usage for it that's maybe useful, but I'm not entertaining it at all on a social level or trying to build up my profile on there or something, or like work on my channel in any social media platform capacity, right? And there's something about for me, the decision to do that is in fact very politically motivated, because there's something about how the direction Mark Zuckerberg chose to take, not only by defending having a like a kind of a monopoly, owning all these different platforms. You could, the same could be maybe said about Jeff Bezos. I mean, I have to admit, I am on this viewing YouTube. Maybe YouTube's not necessarily any better about this, but there's something about the overt show of support for the Trump regime that the likes of Bezos and Zuckerberg have been showing that has motivated me to not support those platforms at all. And it's not just that. It's also the way, I mean, I don't have to waste too much time telling you why I don't use social media, right? But that could also be seen to be as a kind of a cynical or a pessimistic kind of attitude of withdrawing from that entirely, right? There's something I wanted to talk about. I was thinking about whether or not to. I also have a Substack blog, and that's also encountering similar problems, where I don't have very many Substack subscribers, and I'm basically writing on Substack as an excuse to, if I have like this urge to post something or communicate something on the internet, it's a way to divert that from tech platforms owned by people like Mark Zuckerberg and other ones, right? So it's like, but there still is this kind of discouraging thing where my efforts to write and create things are not going very. And so there's, whether I'm making YouTube videos or whether I'm writing things on Substack, there is a kind of a discouraging quality to it, that. And the thing about, I think when it comes to like the idea of doomerism in all this, when applied to personal projects, there's this question: is there any hope in continuing, or am I just persisting in a futile, stubborn, ignorant kind of thing, right? And I don't know if it's too much of a one of the things, though, that I've noticed is that if you take, for example, the people who are most successful on these kinds of platforms and the kind of low quality of what makes it to be popular. I'm talking about like people like MR.BEAST or whatever. MR.BEAST was interviewed, and he said that he was actually very, very kind of depressed, right? And that there's a sort of soullessness or kind of emptiness to like just doing whatever it takes to gain the most popularity, to gain the most attention, to gain the most views. And it kind of, even if you rise all the way to the top, then the price you have to pay is a kind of existential dread or depression or something like that. And that there's a certain kind of, sometimes people use the expression black pilled or something. And I noticed that, MR.BEAST wears a lot of black or something. I also noticed that, Elon Musk also wearing a lot of black, also describing himself as dark goth MAGA when he decided to join forces with Donald Trump. Also, like Elon Musk saying that his has a issue to do with depression, right? And he has to take ketamine to put himself into a positive state of mind, because otherwise he might give in to the problem of Doomerism or whatever, right? And there's this kind of thing that in this kind of context, there's actually, if you kind of take this thing that the people who are most successful, who are at the top, tend to actually be really depressed and need to take mind-altering substances to convince themselves to keep doing what they do, that if those guys were to accept the Doomerism of the situation, it may, you could just be like, wait a minute, like imagine if you were somebody like MR.BEAST who had put all this time and energy and money into doing something that did get you a lot of success in terms of the numbers, but that you felt just very depressed about, or very soulless, or very shallow about, and that in that context, the idea of a doomer mentality would be like, hey, you know what? I actually don't have to do this, right? It's not making me happy. It's not making the world a better place. It's just perpetuating a lot of bullshit that people, most people are probably only watching this to criticize it or to make fun of it or something like that. And then in contrast to that, you could say that I have the luxury that I could sit here in my room, I could hit the record button, and I could make videos day in and day out, and without having the pressure to conform to the same patterns of success as these guys who what do they get out of it aside from being totally depressed, right? So there's something about, but the thing is, like, what I'm trying to say is that I also was watching a video recently where Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins interviewed Al Jourgensen from Ministry, and Al Jourgensen from Ministry was, I mean, it's pretty, like, I don't know, for some reason it just stuck with me that he was saying this, like, over the course of his career and the different changes, that he just had to do what, you go with what floats your boat, right? And there's something about it where there's some kind of funny contradiction where sometimes the things that might float my boat may also be things that do not score very well in terms of online popularity points, right? But my will to keep going, or my will to come up with clever ideas to strategize more views or more online success and popularity is kind of, I kind of don't care about that so much, right? But I do have a will to explore different, things that I may not be, new books or new ideas or new things that I'm interested in. And there's a problem that I have where I tend to like to mix things that don't go together, right? Or that there's a certain, like, I like making, like, there's a certain standard for what people expect out of doing astrology videos, and maybe it's just my personality, but I prefer to be more experimental, and in that sense I kind of feel like I am coloring outside the lines a little bit, in that I try to incorporate, I see it as an opportunity to do things that other people don't do, right? And one an example of this, there's people that I'm inspired by, is here I've got after Andy Warhol destroyed art as we knew it, he produced this album with Nico and the Velvet Underground, the very first Velvet Underground record, right? And this is a significant record because Lou Reed, as he was saying, was a member of a kind of upper state New York kind of literary scene, and he wasn't coming from this quality of like lowbrow rock and roll. He was more of a sophisticated, literate kind of guy. And from this perspective, he saw an opportunity that there were all sorts of, what do you talk about in rock and roll? You talk about like, your Beach Boys, your Little Deuce Coupe, and your, driving along in my automobile, kind of stuff. It was there was in this really narrow, myopic, there's not really, there's the idea of a medium of art, of like pop music, is that as a literate guy, he saw there's all sorts of different directions that you could take this in, and he, regardless of whether people are liked it or not, that's exactly what he did, right? Like, apparently, like, for example, the song Venus and Furs, where he said that everybody was all freaked out from Venus and Furs because it was like about S&M and bondage and stuff. And he was saying that there's a book. And he was just kind of like, there's this book that like nobody in the rock and roll world knows about. And I just have this great opportunity to take this thing and combine it with rock and roll. And then, unfortunately, there was this kind of thing that most people, he, from his point of view, thought that most people hated what he was doing. Maybe and eventually a few people it caught on with, but there's this. I've always been inspired by this idea that the thing that makes it that I'm not like that if you take these really popular rock and roll bands like Led Zeppelin and stuff like that, I do appreciate Led Zeppelin for what they do, but there's something always kind of tired and played out about it, or the sense that like. Yeah, we know everybody likes Led Zeppelin, right? Like, yeah, we all know about like, we've all heard those songs a million times, right? There's something about like, are you inspired to just like try to take something that was popular at one point in time and just repeat it and never change? For me, the exciting thing is in the opportunity of experimentation and trying new things out, right? And in order to do that, it takes a certain amount of risk taking, and it's like baseball, sometimes maybe I knock it out of the park, sometimes I strike out, I can't, but I'm going to, like, I basically wanted to make this too, because in the aftermath of recording a couple of videos, which didn't do very well in terms of getting likes, I feel like I kind of recorded a video which was kind of bullshit in a way where I was, I don't know, I wasn't, I was saying that perhaps what I was doing with my videos were too political or something, and that, maybe the solution would be to focus less on politics or current events or something, but I feel like I was just bullshitting, right? But there is this basic point in that I was trying something out in one of those videos where I was taking the idea of indigenous politics and specifically this book here. Like I made a video where I was talking about this book and nobody liked it. I don't think nobody liked it at all, right? And in the news recently, there was an indigenous guy who was an actor who just got shot, and people are suggesting maybe it's a hate crime, and I think this is sort of there's something about this where I don't know. I'm not going to. I think if I'm going to continue with this channel, it'd be better for me to clarify or to keep in mind this principle of foreign agreements, right? To be impeccable about my word, and that I'm not going to just play some bullshit game where I'm saying, oh, sorry for those videos that didn't do very well, that nobody liked because I was being too political, because I was trying to expand my mind by reading new reading material that I don't usually use, trying to investigate new ideas, trying to be a trailblazer, try to incorporate some new idea into astrology that hasn't been used before, that is more on the cutting edge of, social theory or something, right? Why should I, if I have every right to experiment, I have every right to make videos that are complete gutter balls, complete flops. It's just part of the process, right? And I have to show a certain amount of emotional maturity and discipline, that if I make a bunch of stuff that doesn't do very well, I'm not just going to try to run to some sort of safe formula of what is supposed to be popular, and allow that to sort of I'm going to experiment as much as I see fit, and I think it's completely within my liberty to do so, right? And in all this, I wanted to talk about this problem about pessimism and doomerism and the politics, and to give an example, right? That the other day, when I was looking at my Facebook, or not, again, I'm not using social media, I'm looking at the algorithmic feed on YouTube, and on the shorts, there was something where the news stations, Canadian news stations, which one thing that's interesting, that I'm, as a Canadian, I get a lot of the national news on YouTube, and I don't even necessarily feel that close of a bond to Eastern Canada or the prairies. I've never been there. I went to Alberta when I was a little kid, and I more recent in my life, I spent a year in Australia. I feel more of a closer bond to my Australian friends than these people who are on the East Coast where I've never been, and I've never met them. I've never hung out there, right? There is something about the national unity of Canada, which is kind of I don't know, it is what it is. I'm a West Coaster, right? And as a West Coaster, but there's a huge fire going on in Manitoba right now, and I clicked one of those YouTube shorts, and it's it showed this the billowing smoke, and then the headline it was some sort of not really a mistake. I guess it was just I guess they were showing a bunch of headlines in rapid succession, but the headline was 13-year-old murders an elderly person, and then meanwhile there's this big it's like some other terrible news story headline juxtaposed onto just smoke and fire that has nothing to do with that, but it's just the whole world is burning down, children are going crazy, joining murder cults or whatever it is, and it's doom and gloom everywhere, right? And it's just this kind of the question is there enough, as a forecaster, is there enough doom and gloom happening already, or is there going to be more doom and gloom on the way, and that at least with astrology, you have a way to identify when this is going to be happening, when these things are going to be the most intense, and you can psychologically prepare yourself in the spirit of stoicism, right, to deal with it, right? But there's something about there's still this topic of doomerism that I wanted to focus on because of the way it's used rhetorically. Because I mean, there's somebody who I've been following who seems to repeat this sentiment to don't give in to doomerism, or don't adopt a doomer attitude. But this is usually in the context of an American content creator, political influencer, creating content for other Americans, and that the topic of doomerism is basically the Donald Trump presidency, the integrity of American democracy, the basic protection of the basic rights and freedoms, and keeping the America a free society. And of course, I'm sympathetic with those the hopes that things don't get really bad in America, any worse than they already are. But at the same time, as a Canadian, it's more to do. I feel a step removed from the situation where there's a question of to what extent is Canada dependent on America, and that to what extent does it get really bad in America? Are we as Canadians fairly insulated from those effects, right? And when Trump was in his presidency the first time around, I was not inclined to go to America at all. And to be honest, oftentimes when other presidents were in power, I wasn't inclined to go to America either. There's something about America, American exceptionalism, or the Americans viewing themselves as the center of the universe, basically, that I've never really related to. Or that, like, I have people who, or I've always, like, kind of found it curious, people who hold a high regard of America in terms of, like, going there to vacation, going there to spend money, or, like, thinking the culture of, like, Hollywood or California or New York is so great or something. And it's sort of like, I'm somewhat relieved to be a Canadian citizen, and I don't necessarily think that where I live is like the coolest place in the world or something, but there's some, I don't know, I take comfort in the fact that even if the United States of America is in fact doomed, that I'm not an American and I don't live there, and it's not my problem. Although the fact is, everything is so, of course, we live in an interconnected world, maybe at some point in time it will be my problem. But for now, it doesn't seem like it's an issue, right? And there is that whole threat of the 51st state stuff. But, I think to take things one step at a time here, we seem to be pretty far away from that being a reality right now. So I'm not very... So if, from a Canadian, for me, Doomerism would be more of the attitude, like, believing that we're going to be taken over by the Americans, right? Like, that would be Doomerism, because I have a certain attachment to the idea of our Canadian sovereignty, or that my concern, or that the whole conversation of Doomerism is mainly focused around Donald Trump and the integrity of American democracy. And it's not, this isn't Doomer, like, there's a different kind of Doomerism. Could be ecological Doomerism about climate change, global warming, the polar ice caps melting, the sea level rising, all that kind of stuff. Like, for example, where I live is actually literally below sea level. And I'm just lucky that, based on climate research, within my lifetime, I probably don't have to worry very much about being flooded out, right? But let's say if I were to, like, have generations and generations of children and offspring, it might be like, at one point in my time, and we're going to be like, we're just going to stay here for the rest of at some point in time, we wouldn't be able to just, like, hunker down on the old family homestead. We'd have, like, it's all going to be flooded eventually, right? And if you have this sort of idea that, if you're putting all this, that, like, Doomerism in that sense, it could be like this town, my hometown where I grew up, and I'm all sentimental about, in a couple hundred years it'll all be underwater, we'll be swimming with the fishes. We're gonna put, like, this is kind of thing where it's like, if you're going to build infrastructure here, don't build the infrastructure where it's going to be underwater, right? Now, that's not the same as, like, total end of the world apocalyptic Doomerism, but it's enough to say that you can at least see that, that acknowledge that climate change is real, and that you're going to have to do some planning around it. It's not the same as saying it's the end of the world, right? And so there is, I think, when it comes to things like also Saturn and Neptune associated with the archetype of the flood, I think some of these kind of things of a it's not doomerism to just be to real talk. Where we live is going to be underwater, and you're all going to have to move, or you're like it's this is, but not within our lifetime, right? So we have this kind of we have and or that you could use that metaphor for the flood being like there could be a coming flood, and we, like Noah's Ark, have to make our preparations for the human race to survive long term and all this kind of stuff. And our whole attitude of doomerism is basically just experiencing ourselves on the precipice of this, right? And the thing about, it's a lot that kind of, if you have that kind of doomerism in conjunction with a kind of mature, rational, scientific stoicism where you can accept the more difficult realities ahead with a kind of a stoic maturity, that's different than being like the doomerism of letting your democracy fall basically to some sort of absurdist fascism where you take all the money away from climate change scientists, right? Like, I think there's two different kinds of doomerism here, right? There's like the doomerism of being like, oh shit, we're fucked because the scientists say this, but we're not, but we know, realistically, there could be all sorts of ways for humanity to survive into the far future and all this kind of stuff. There's a different kind of doomerism that where you're just really pessimistic about the biggest superpower in the world being the way it is, which is not believing in science, not believing in climate change, like basically being psychotically detached from reality or something like that. And whatever the fear of whatever consequences are going to come as a reality check for that problem, right? And I think there is something to do with Saturn and Neptune, which highlights this problem about ignorance, stupidity, being naively blind to the reality. And there's this kind of like, it's the doomerism of just watching like a train wreck or a car crash unfold and being like, like, at least that is at the. But the thing is, when it's one of the world's biggest superpowers, it is what it is, right? For me, I have to take an attitude, of course, of like self-care, in that I don't want to make content where I'm just spending all my time focusing on the darkest and gloomiest things, but based on the fact of like this is the archetype of Saturn and Neptune, and that this is what we're faced with this year. For me, it seems like there's this opportunity there's a promising opportunity to make astrology videos and astrology content during one of the most interesting years that we've have, so in recent history, and to observe it as it unfolds, right? And to me, it seems like a waste of potential not to take advantage of this opportunity, right? However, the opportunity. There's a lot of stuff that just factors into the emotion of grief and gloom, and just being all sorts of bad stuff that's going on in the world with all these wars and whatnot. That naturally, I'd rather not talk about. Right? I have a natural inclination not to go there. And also the fact that, if I were to go there, it's like there's something about like is it my business to go there? I'm not like a war correspondent, news journalist. I'm not some expert on that kind of stuff. If I'm doing it from the capacity of being an astrologer, the premise is that as an astrologer, because I pay attention to this astrology stuff more than other people do, then I can see what's going on with the astrology, and that the astrology is supposed to grant me some sort of special insight into what's going on that I wouldn't be able to see otherwise. But nonetheless, like if you wanted to get really into the nitty gritty about like, let's say the war with like Israel and Palestine or something like that, like I'm sure I would, if you wanted me to make divinations about like when the next like crazy attack is going to happen. Yeah, I mean, if I was like a war correspondent over there on the ground, immersed in that whole situation, yeah, I could probably do all sorts of very highly specific divinations to sort of, but you know, I don't really think that's really what I want to get involved with, right? But nonetheless, it is, like, this is kind of what I'm trying to say. I feel like there's some kind of, at least, you know, I can be thankful that, but there's some kind of thing where it's like, if, imagine another course of action where I just don't pay attention to that stuff. I don't pay attention to the astrology. I don't, there's something about living a life of kind of privileged comfort and in a suburban, you know, like kind of well-off area, that if I withdraw my attention from the global sphere and I focus only on the most immediate, grounded, material, local thing, then what I have to deal with is primarily my family situation with my family life, which it is, and the basic circumstances of social atomization and fragmented society that affect all of us, basically, right? And in that, if I just withdraw all my energy from all this political stuff, from all this environmental stuff, and I just deal with me and my own life as a little person, then I'm basically end up in this sort of hamster wheel thing about being stuck as just like somebody who's frustrated living with my family, who doesn't feel like I have a lot of options because the cost of living is too expensive. Which, and then that brings back into the picture all of the political stuff, because the cost of living and the economy and all this kind of stuff is wrapped up in this whole mess, right? And there's a sort of thing where it's like there's a sort of idea of doomerism or pessimism that I never identified myself as a doomer. I've never would label myself that, but at some point in time, you have to, I think, be honest about what it is you're involved with, and what it is that you're invested in, and to just legitimately say, am I getting anything out of this, or is it just a waste of my time and energy, and like of this kind of, or like there's this issue about if I were to just withdraw everything from this big whole problems of the environment, the economy, politics, and just focus on the non-political personal life of my own problems, then there's this whole other, perhaps microcosm of my own pessimism about my own life, my own unhappiness or something like this. But it's kind of, these like sort of small petty concerns in the grand stage of things, right? But nonetheless, there's this issue about at some point in time, I think it is valid. I don't think doomerism is as bad as people make it out, because sometimes if you're completely honest with yourself, and you're honest that what you're involved in, you are involved in something that's not going anywhere where you can see any good outcome, then doomerism is actually productive, because it allows you to have this sort of moment of reckoning where you can say, why on earth am I putting my energy into this when I know that I'm headed toward a dead end here, right? And can I redirect somewhere better, right? But if that is only intelligible through social media quantification and success by social media metrics, there's something really cynical and doomerish about just playing the numbers game, right? Because then you end up like MR.BEAST or whatever. You end up like these guys who are just like, nothing is important to them aside from getting their numbers up, aside from getting their metrics up. And I'm just trying to establish that my ethos here, of what my guiding principle is, to do the opposite thing, that to instead find something that, if on its own, if that is interesting enough to keep me enthusiastic, to keep me inspired, to keep me on like a dog who's got the scent, who's like, sniffing after the scent, to keep me in that state of mind, even if the metrics don't look very good, right? Because for me, that is more important than going through the motions, in this really artificial way just to keep the numbers up, right? I ended up listening to this thing last night. F. Scott Fitzgerald's Crack Up, which they mention in A Thousand Plateaus, in the 3 novellas. And there's this thing where F. Scott Fitzgerald is talking about himself going through this change where he realized that so much of his, of what his pattern of socialization was this kind of conditioned false self. And it was like kind of like the artifice or the scaffolding or something that at some point in time that just fell away, right? And that he described it as if that people were like he was writing checks for a bank account that has already been over withdrawn, right? Or that you're trying to do this thing that is like, I think it brings in, it was an interesting thing to listen to because it brought into this whole thing about being authentic, right? The authenticity versus doing something that is maybe fake or superficial, but it works the machinery of the system to get your views up, to get your popularity up or whatever, to get your acceptance up, right? There's something about where F. Scott Fitzgerald was saying that so much of his social life, or the pretense to him being like a member of society and involved in all these social clubs and stuff like that, there was something about it where the fakeness or the artificialness of it was just like a skin that he had to shed off, right? It was like some old, dead, crusty thing and the more that he kept trying to play that game, it was like he was writing checks for an overdrawn bank account that he didn't have the money for. And sorry, it's not there. I can't do it. So there's more, and the authenticity. If there is some sort of spark of motivation that keeps you going, it's like. That kind of authenticity maybe doesn't give a shit if it doesn't do well for the numbers, right? Because it's more about the being inspired about this process where there's maybe part of what makes it exciting is actually that you're not just going with this cold calculated certainty that you know exactly what's going to be the thing that makes you popular. You're taking a hit. You don't know if you're going to strike out or if you're going to knock it out of the park, right? Or that there's or even if it is like a total failure commercially, there's some other metric by which you can justify it as being worth your time, not just an exercise of cynical doomerism. And for this reason, there are certain strategies that people use in this game. I think especially during this time when so much of the attention is going on these big catastrophic things going on with the doom scroll and the climate change and the war and all this kind of stuff, that it's like the human being, the individual, in comparison, may feel very minuscule, very tiny, insignificant. And in that sense, there's a sense that in order to be able to compete at all in the attention economy, it's necessary to make the most sensationalistic content possible, right? And basically, I'm just saying that part of what my approach is to have the discipline not to do that, right? The discipline not to just try to draw in attention, draw in clicks, draw in approval through this very, contrived, trying to figure out what's going to trigger the most emotional response to hook people in through this like, but there's of course, there's a temptation to do that because with doom and gloom, there's something about like the really polarizing forces of extreme fear and aversion versus like attraction or whatever, that there's something about that where it gets you by, they got the hooks in your lower chakras, is it the end of the world, right? I mean, this is what I honestly got a kind of, I don't know. There's that whole thing. Apparently the doomsday clock was pretty close to midnight a few years ago. and all the influencers were just making videos about how, I mean, I was confused. Everybody's making videos about how it's the apocalypse, and I don't know, man. I'm getting up every day and looking, and the sun's still shining, the birds are still singing. Like, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it, right? To me, it seemed more like a lot of people figured that the only way that they had any chance at getting any attention was to just be like Chicken Little, right? And I don't want to, I'm trying to find the right balance where I feel like it's a cheap move to give into that game. But at the same time, I think there's something about, I don't want to waste the opportunity of having an astrology channel and, in the year 2025 and being able to approach the events as they unfold, and with a degree of openness and experimentation, and to keep the creative fire alive, which makes me enjoy doing this and makes me want to continue, right? So maybe I'm just doing this as my own kind of pep rally or something like that. But the main point is that you may like this video, you may subscribe, or you may dislike. You could even unsubscribe if you want. I don't care. I'm going to keep doing it, and I'm not going to give into these petty attempts to sensationalize, to keep in attention. Right? It's not in alignment with my principles of what I feel responsible. Being a responsible content creator is. Maybe that, and of course, maybe I may come off as being judgmental as maybe from other creators, but I'm sorry that there's certain styles of creating content that it's not what I'm going to. I don't want to affiliate myself with that kind of schlock. Okay, I hope you understand. I hope I didn't hurt too many people's feelings. I don't mean to be too out of my high horse. I'm just trying to do it the way that feels right to me. Thanks for understanding. Thanks for your continued support. Thanks for watching.